At Thanksgiving, my dad said he'd sell everything, and I was getting nothing. My name is Morgan. I'm 32, and I learned to disappear at a mahogany table big enough to seat 3 generations and still leave room for silence. Thanksgiving at our house has always been theater crystal, rehearsing its shine under chandelier light china, holding its breath for inevitable speeches, mother's smile lacquered into something that wouldn't crack, even if the room did. I wore a simple black dress, the kind that slips past notice, and took my familiar place at the far end, where the candles look like distant cities, and a daughter can vanish without anyone calling her name. I told myself I didn't mind. Vanishing had been my safest talent since girlhood. Easier to be a shadow than a disappointment, easier to be quiet than wrong. What no one knew, not my father, not my brother, with his practiced toast, not my sister angling her phone for the perfect family legacy story, was that the girl at the far end had built an empire in the dark. Their eyes looked past me and into the mirror of themselves the way they always had. It would have been almost funny if it hadn't been the raw, pulsing truth of my life. I used to think my father's dismissals were a weather pattern I could outrun. But some storms live inside your house. Some storms carve their initials into the beams. He looked younger in that light, my father, because certainty is good for the skin. He tapped his water glass and the room stilled, even the crystals seemed to lean in. This is how he likes it all, eyes all silence, all stage. I felt my heartbeat study the tempo of his voice, and then refuse it. I have an announcement, he said, and the announcement was everything and nothing at once. He was selling the company. We were getting nothing. He framed it as legacy, as philanthropy, as a man's duty to history and education, and the clean line of his name etched across time. I heard the sentence beneath the sentence. You were never the point, Morgan. You were never the heir. You were always the audience. At Thanksgiving, my dad announced, there are angers that roar, and angers that ring like a struck glass. Mine chimed through my bones. Garrett sputtered. Megan staged her tears. Mother poured herself a taller drink. I tasted pecan and salt and the oldest humiliation. The chandelier hummed like electricity. My fork made a small, precise sound when I set it down. All the years of looking small to survive all the boardrooms where I was sweetness instead of strategy. All the times I slept on the floor of a studio apartment while writing code that could swallow our outdated product line whole. Those years stood up behind me like quiet witnesses. I realized I wasn't trembling. I realized I had outgrown the radius of his approval and hadn't noticed until this very breath. What's the name of the buyer? I asked, because questions are a scalpel and a shield. He straightened with the pride of a man who believes he is unveiling a painting. Everest Holdings, he said, savoring each syllable like it was an accomplishment he had earned. $50 million. Tomorrow. Signatures and inevitability. I took a sip of water and found it tasted like coastline, like the moment you stop paddling and feel the boat accept the ocean. I could have played it differently. I could have waited for coffee, for the hush of hallways, for the safer kindness of a private blow. But some truths only work when everyone hears them at once. Dad, I said, I am Everest. The clock in the hall began counting our seconds, 1, 2, 3, like a witness. He blinked the way a man blinks when the painting moves. Garrett's wine bled across the tablecloth like a stain the house would remember. Megan's phone quivered in her hand. Mother's glass lowered, then lifted undecided. It's astonishing how swiftly a room can convert disbelief into anger. He called it impossible first, then preposterous, then betrayal. He insisted the world I'd built was a fiction I told myself to justify the life I chose without him. But I had receipts, the card, the filings, the quiet constellation of companies I had acquired like chess pieces while they were applauding the yacht. I did not raise my voice. I did not try to explain the nights or the ramen or the failures folded into the architecture of what now stood. I simply told the truth, the way I wish someone had told it for me when I was 22 and trembling in a boardroom. This is good, this is necessary, this is happening. And still somewhere under the steel hurt splintered. Because daughters do not want to be right as much as they want to be loved, because there is a difference between winning and being welcomed. The chandelier trembled with our history. The candles leaned. My brother accused my sister, negotiated. My mother stared at me the way a person watches weather change. Father delivered his favorite verdict dressed as a choice: be my daughter, or be the one who took my company. The old bargain he's always offered: shrink into belonging or stand and be cast out. I looked at the table that had made me small and felt myself take up my full height. I am both, I said, but not like a plea, like a law. In that moment, I understood that the person I had been building was not only a founder, not only a CEO, not only a tactician who could see the board 10 moves ahead. She was a woman who would not abandon herself to stay invited. The room could hate me. The room could learn me. The room could empty. I would remain. Down the hall, the grandfather clock exhaled another minute. Somewhere inside the walls, the house's old bones shifted, as if they too were making space. I reached for my water, steadied my breath, and prepared for the reckoning that would follow, the reveal, the legal calls, the threats, the leverage no one expected me to hold. But beneath all that, there was a quieter reckoning I hadn't planned for: what to do with the small, still part of me that had waited even tonight for my father's eyes to soften, for someone to say my name and mean it. The air after my confession felt heavy, like thunder trapped inside the walls. My brother Garrett slammed his fist against the table, his voice breaking through the stillness like glass shattering. He accused me of plotting against the family, of stealing what was rightfully his, as though my late nights, my sacrifices, my silent years were nothing but a trick played on him. Megan, ever the actress, let tears roll down her cheeks while calculating the right angle for pity. My mother's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but no words emerged. Only my father looked directly at me, and in his stare I recognized the same disdain he had carried for years, now sharpened into something far more dangerous. "You made me irrelevant," he said, each word landing like a gavel. His face was calm, but his knuckles whitened around the stem of his glass. "You think success outside these walls makes you more than the family that raised you?" I wanted to scream at him that family hadn't raised me. It had survived me. They had ignored my presence at every gathering, dismissed my ideas at every turn, laughed when I spoke about innovation, about change, about wanting more. But screaming would only give him power. So I breathed deeply and let the silence accuse him on my behalf. The chandelier above flickered a strange quiver of light that seemed almost symbolic, like even the house was uncertain which side to illuminate. In that flickering, I remembered the years I had hidden in my childhood bedroom, scribbling designs, drawing maps of what I wanted to build, whispering dreams into a dark room that answered only with echoes. I remembered overhearing my father telling my mother I would marry well if I was lucky, as though my worth existed only in what I could attach myself to. I remembered the heat in my cheeks when Garrett told me to stop pretending I was smart enough to run anything more complicated than errands. Every scar from those moments burned fresh again. And yet beneath the anger was something colder: clarity. For so long I had believed that someday they would see me, that my victories would force their pride, that my persistence would soften their rejection. But that night at Thanksgiving, I understood recognition would never come from them. It would have to come from me, or not at all. My father leaned forward, lowering his voice until it almost sounded intimate. "I will never forgive you," he said. The words were not thunderous. They were a blade pressed gently against my throat. Garrett muttered agreement. Megan sniffled in dramatic affirmation. And suddenly, I was the villain in a play they had rehearsed their whole lives. And still I did not flinch. Because for the first time I realized something else. If they could so easily cast me out for daring to stand tall, then I had never truly been inside to begin with. I stood my chair, scraping softly against the hardwood, the sound sharp in the silence. My hands were steady, though, inside my chest my heart was pounding like a drum of war. "You will remember this night," I told them, my voice even. "Not because I betrayed you, but because you finally saw me and couldn't stand it." I walked out of that dining room without waiting for dessert, without glancing back at the candles or the crystal or the legacy they had always worshipped. Each step felt both terrifying and liberating, like shedding chains that had been welded to my skin since birth. Behind me, voices rose in accusation, in fury, in betrayal. But ahead of me, the door opened into the cool November night, and for the first time in years, the air felt breathable. I didn't know then what the fallout would be: lawsuits, gossip, family ties turned into weapons. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: they had taken everything from me my whole life. This time, I had taken something back, and it was only the beginning. The days that followed were chaos wrapped in silence. I stayed in my apartment, the blinds half drawn, my phone lighting up with endless calls from lawyers, relatives, and even old acquaintances who suddenly remembered my number. Garrett's voice left angry voicemails. He threatened to drag me through court to prove I had schemed against the family. Megan texted paragraphs laced with guilt, telling me I had ruined Thanksgiving, as if that holiday hadn't been ruined years ago by silence and contempt. My mother left the shortest message of all: come home and apologize. But home was no longer the place they meant. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee untouched, staring at the stack of documents in front of me. Proof of ownership, contracts, receipts of every sleepless night that had turned into a stepping stone. Everest Holdings was not just a company, it was my fortress, my revenge, my vindication. And yet, looking at those papers, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow. Because victory, when you've longed your whole life for acceptance, is strangely quiet. The media caught wind of the story before I had time to prepare. Headlines twisted the truth. Daughter steals family legacy. Thanksgiving betrayal in boardroom drama. Strangers on the internet dissected my choices, painted me as greedy or brilliant, depending on which angle earned them more outrage. My father fed the fire, giving interviews where he called me ungrateful, selfish, a usurper who had humiliated him in front of his peers. Watching him on television, seeing his face lined with fury, I realized something painful. He had never spoken of me with pride, only with possession. I tried to ignore it, but one night exhaustion broke me. I curled up on the couch, tears staining the fabric, whispering to myself, why wasn't I ever enough? The question was as old as my childhood, echoing in the halls of my memory. Report cards, ignored achievements, brushed aside, dreams dismissed. And now, even after I had built an empire, even after I had proven myself beyond measure, the answer remained the same. To them, I would never be enough. It was Aunt Clara who showed up at my door 3 days later, her arms filled with grocery bags, her eyes soft with concern. She wasn't rich, she wasn't powerful, but she had always been the only one who asked how I was doing without expecting something in return. She hugged me tight, the kind of embrace that reminded me of what family should feel like. Let them fight their battles, she whispered. You've already won yours. Her words lit something inside me. Maybe victory wasn't about making them see me. Maybe it was about learning to live without their gaze at all. Still, the fight wasn't over. Lawsuits were threatened. Inheritance arguments began circling like vultures, and every dinner table in our extended family turned into a debate about me. But beneath all the noise, I found clarity. I had carried their rejection all my life. Now I would carry only myself. One evening, I walked past the old family business, its sign glowing faintly against the dark. I paused, staring at the building that had been the altar of my father's worship. Memories surged, running through those halls as a child, overhearing meetings, watching employees who seemed more like family than the people I lived with. I thought about how easily he had been willing to sell it away, as if the people inside were just numbers on a page. That was when I made my decision. I wouldn't destroy the company as some might expect. No, I would transform it. I would take the legacy that had been denied me and make it something greater, something that could never again be weaponized against me. If my father thought selling it was the end, I would prove it was only the beginning. But even as I planned my next moves, I knew the greatest battle wasn't in the courtroom or the boardroom. It was in my heart, learning how to stop waiting for love from people who had shown me none. That I realized would be the truest form of revenge. Weeks bled into months, and the firestorm only grew. Every headline seemed to carve me into a villain. Ungrateful daughter, destroys family bonds. Thanksgiving scandal, ends in betrayal. At first, I wanted to defend myself, to shout that I had worked in silence, while they dismissed me that Everest was mine, not because of bloodlines, but because of sweat and sacrifice. But then I realized the truth. People believed the story that suited their own wounds. If they needed me to be the villain, so they could feel like heroes in their own broken families, then so be it. What kept me steady was purpose. I began meeting with employees, walking through the offices that my father had once ruled like a king. I listened, really listened to their fears, their hopes, the years of loyalty they had given without being heard. They looked at me cautiously at first, unsure if I was just another heart-chasing power. But as days turned into weeks, suspicion shifted. I showed up without cameras, without pretense, with only the promise that this company was no longer a stage for one man's ego, but a home for many voices. And in their tentative nods, their quiet thanks, I felt something I had never felt around my own blood belonging. Meanwhile, the war at home grew colder. My brother Garrett filed a lawsuit claiming I had manipulated our father's decision, even though his accusations crumbled under the weight of evidence. Megan paraded herself as the betrayed sister, staging interviews where she wept about family unity. My father, ever the patriarch, refused to speak directly to me, but sent word through lawyers demanding settlements, threatening to cut me out of what little inheritance remained. It was almost laughable. They had already cut me out long ago of birthdays, of praise, of love. Money was just the final symbol. But despite the chaos, there were nights the silence was unbearable. Nights when I sat alone in my penthouse, lights of the city sprawling beneath me, and wondered if I had traded my soul for vindication. The truth was, I didn't want their money, their approval, or even their apologies anymore. I wanted something they could never give me: peace. One night I received a call I didn't expect. My mother. Her voice was frail, stripped of the venom she usually carried. "Morgan," she whispered, "your father's heart. It's failing." The silence that followed nearly crushed me. I had dreamed of this moment before, of him weakened, finally forced to face his mortality. But the fantasy didn't taste like I thought it would. It was bitter hollow. I felt no triumph, only a dull ache that pulsed with all the years he had refused to see me. I went to the hospital, not out of duty, but out of some fragile, broken piece of myself that still longed for closure. He lay there in the bed, tubes in his arms, monitors beeping a rhythm that reminded me how close the end was. His eyes flickered open, and for the first time he looked small. "You think you won," he rasped, his voice as thin as paper. "But you lost us." I swallowed hard. The little girl inside me wanted to beg, "See me just once as yours." But the woman I had become knew better. I sat beside him and said softly, "I never had you to lose." Tears burned my eyes as I stood to leave. There would be no reconciliation, no Hollywood ending where he admitted his mistakes. His pride was a cage he would never escape. But as I walked out of that hospital room, I realized something vital: forgiveness wasn't for him. It was for me. To stop carrying the weight of his rejection like chains around my chest. To finally let go. When he died weeks later, the family gathered again at that same mahogany table, this time draped in black. Garrett glared, Megan sobbed for the cameras, and my mother drank silently, her eyes glassy. No one looked at me, but for once I didn't need them to. I wasn't their shadow anymore. I wasn't invisible. I was the storm they never saw coming, and the calm that followed after. I stood to speak, my voice steady. "He built an empire," I said, glancing at the coffin. "But he forgot to build a family. I won't make the same mistake." And in that vow, I felt the chains break. The story didn't end with revenge or inheritance. It ended with freedom, the kind that comes not from tearing others down, but from refusing to be torn down any longer. So if you've ever been dismissed, betrayed, or told you'd never be enough, hear me now: your worth isn't written by those who refuse to see you. It's written by the battles you survive, the voice you claim, the life you build on your own terms. Thank you for listening to my story. If it spoke to your heart, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment about your own journey. Your voice deserves to be heard.